Does global law restrict our right to self-defense, or have new catastrophic threats finally forced the world to adapt its oldest rules of war?
That's really the core question, isn't it? We have this framework of international law built for a different time for conflicts between nations.
And now it has to deal with something entirely new.
Exactly. It's trying to absorb non-state actors that have state-level power, state-level deadliness. It's an evolution driven by pure necessity.
Okay, so let's ground this deep dive in something happening right now. We have to start with the recent news out of Syria.
Yes, the reports from Palmyra.
Reports just surfaced a few days ago, first on social media and then confirmed, that U.S. troops were killed in that central town.
And that tragedy is just such a critical, stark reminder that the political narrative of an ISIS defeat is, well, it's premature at best.
So the major battles are over, but the threat isn't.
Not at all. The threat has fragmented. It's become a guerrilla war, which means U.S. forces are still in these incredibly high-risk zones doing counterinsurgency work that, frankly, gets very little attention back home.
And what makes this Palmyra incident so relevant to our discussion today, to the law, is the ambiguity around who the attacker was.
Right. The initial report said a lone ISIS gunman.
But then you hear these persistent rumors that it might have been an insider attack, a green-on-blue incident.
Maybe a partner force member with split loyalties, to the regime, to some other group, or even a dormant ISIS cell.
And that risk of infiltration, it just speaks to the huge challenge of operating in a place like Syria.
Absolutely. Our sources really emphasize this. When you rely on local forces in regions run by, let's say, unstable or corrupt governments, you are accepting this constant risk. The very people you train and arm might also be your enemies.
Which brings us to the core mission of this deep dive. What is the foundational legal reason that allows the U.S. to put soldiers in that danger in the first place? To operate there, often without the host nation's consent?
That is the question. We're looking at scholarly legal analyses that track how the war against groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda has fundamentally reshaped international law, specifically the right of self-defense.
So we want to uncover how these old rules, the ones made for state-on-state conflict, are struggling to keep up with terror groups that have the power of a nation.
And to really understand that legal shift, you have to first appreciate just the sheer scale of this new threat. After 9/11, everything changed.
The adversary was completely different.
Completely. Suddenly you have these non-state actors who can use, and I'm quoting from one source here, relatively inexpensive and commercially available technology to launch devastating attacks from thousands of miles away. It basically democratized mass killing.
And the numbers are just staggering. The 9/11 attacks killed over 3,000 people. That's more American casualties than the entire War of 1812. It's more than were killed at Pearl Harbor. This wasn't a border skirmish anymore.
No, this was global warfare, and it was launched by an entity that didn't have a capital city or an embassy.
Then ISIS came along and just escalated the problem to a whole new level. Our sources call it an uber-terrorist group.
And they were. By 2014, ISIS had seized control of about 30% of Syria and Iraq.
Just to put that in perspective for you, that's a physical territory roughly the size of the United Kingdom.
And it wasn't just empty land. They captured the actual infrastructure of a state.
Right. The oil fields, the banks.
Exactly. The sources detail how they took billions in assets, oil, bank funds, sophisticated military hardware, tanks, armored vehicles. I mean, this group had massive wealth, complex organization, and access to truly destructive weaponry.
So they had all the attributes of a state.
All the functional attributes, yes.
Yeah.
But, and this is the crucial part, none of the accountability or responsibilities that come with being a sovereign nation.
Which created this legal nightmare. You're facing an enemy with state-level power, but the law only recognizes armed attacks coming from other states. So how did the old restrictive rules handle that?
Well, they failed. Initially, they just couldn't cope because they were bound by the UN Charter, specifically Article 51.
And Article 51 says a state can use force in self-defense, but only if an armed attack occurs.
Correct. But historically, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, had a very, very high bar for what that meant.
And that high bar was this concept of state attribution, is that right?
That's it, state attribution. It meant a victim state, say the U.S., could only legally use force against a terror group in another country if that host country had effective control over the group's actions.
Wait, effective control, so they had to be directing them?
Yes. That standard comes from a famous case, the 1986 Nicaragua case. It wasn't enough for the government to just tolerate the terrorists. They had to be, in essence, Puppeteers.
So let me get this straight. If a terror group was openly operating in a country, planning attacks on America, but the local government wasn't actively directing them, we legally couldn't touch them on that soil.
That was the interpretation.
Yeah.
Precisely. And look, the original intent was to protect the sovereignty of weaker nations, to stop powerful countries from invading their neighbors on a flimsy pretext.
But the result...
The unintended consequence was catastrophic. It created absolute safe havens. It meant terror groups could use failed or unwilling states as launch pads for global terror, and the victim nations had their hands legally tied.
That is a massive security vacuum. And after 9/11, it was just an impossible position to maintain. So what was the legal fix? How did the U.S. get past that?
Response came almost immediately after the attacks. It was the birth of a new legal idea, the Bush Doctrine.
Right, I remember the statement. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
That was the moment. That statement signaled a huge shift. It said that immediate self-defense and national security now trumped that old restrictive ICJ standard.
But it wasn't just a political statement. It had some legal roots.
It did, yes. It wasn't pulled out of thin air. It was grounded in a very old principle from the 1949 Corfu Channel case.
Okay.
That case established that every state has a duty to not knowingly allow its territory to be used for acts that harm other states. The Bush Doctrine basically took that idea and updated it for the age of terror.
So it challenged the old ICJ rule.
It did. It asserted the right to act against non-state actors in countries that were either unwilling or unable to control them.
Okay, so there's the key phrase. Unwilling or unable. The ICJ demanded the host country be actively controlling the terrorists, but the new doctrine said just being unable to stop them was enough.
That is the single most important distinction that defined the post-9/11 legal world. And that unwilling or unable doctrine gave the U.S. the legal basis it needed for Afghanistan.
Because the Taliban government was unwilling.
Repeatedly. They ignored UN demands to shut down al-Qaeda's camps, to hand over bin Laden. That unwillingness to suppress the threat is what legally justified the invasion. And this shift was so profound that legal scholars actually called it a Grotian moment.
A Grotian moment. I find that fascinating. You know, you tend to think of international law changing slowly over decades. So how did this become a moment of rapid acceleration?
It's a reference to Hugo Grotius, who's basically the father of modern international law from back in the 17th century. And a Grotian moment is one of those rare, exceptional events. Think about the Nuremberg trials or the UN's formation. That causes such a fundamental change in the world that it forces customary international law to form incredibly quickly.
The old, slow process just couldn't keep up.
It couldn't handle the speed and the global scope of the new threat. The severity of it forced the legal system to adapt almost overnight.
And it seems like the fight against ISIS was what finally cemented this doctrine into law.
It was the final push. The ICJ had actually tried to resist the U.S. position in a couple of cases in the mid-2000s, but ISIS changed everything. The attacks in late 2015 were the undeniable game changer.
We're talking about the bombing of the Russian airliner.
224 people killed. And then the Paris attacks just a couple of weeks later. 130 dead, hundreds more injured. These events proved to the entire world that ISIS was a global and unprecedented threat.
And that's when the international community finally got on the same page.
Everyone recognized the threat to global stability. The UN Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 2249 in December 2015.
And that resolution called ISIS a global threat and called for all necessary measures to wipe out its safe haven in Syria.
Right. And here's the key legal connection. The resolution didn't explicitly authorize military force. But the French sponsor of the resolution made it clear at the time that action could now be based on Article 51 on self-defense. That unanimous global confirmation was the final piece of the puzzle. It sealed the Grotian moment.
It effectively made it permissible to act against these groups, even if the host state is just unable to stop them.
Exactly. Not just unwilling or complicit, merely unable. That was a huge change.
Which brings us to a really crucial distinction the law makes. The line between lawful self-defense and prohibited retaliation.
It's an absolutely essential legal boundary. Armed reprisals or retaliation are strictly forbidden under international law. They violate what's called a jus cogens norm.
Which is, what, like the highest possible legal principle?
It's the bedrock, the non-negotiable principles. There are no exceptions.
So why are reprisals so forbidden? I mean, after a major terror attack, they can feel morally justified.
They can feel that way, but the legal purpose of self-defense is all about prevention. It's about stopping an ongoing or an imminent attack.
Okay.
Reprisals are different. They are after the fact. They're punitive. They're about vengeance or punishment for something that's already happened. The law sees them as escalatory and not actually connected to stopping the current threat.
And we've seen U.S. actions, even popular ones, get criticized for crossing that line.
We have. The sources point to a few examples. President Clinton's 1998 missile strikes in Sudan and Afghanistan after the embassy bombings. They were widely criticized by legal experts as unlawful reprisals.
Punitive strikes, not defensive ones.
Correct. And more recently, President Trump's missile attacks against Syria in 2017 and 2018, the ones responding to chemical weapons use. Many critics also viewed those as unlawful armed reprisals, distinct from the legal right of self-defense, even if they were popular here.
So the distinction really matters. Moral outrage doesn't grant a license for vengeance under international law.
It does not. The use of force has to be necessary, it has to be proportional, and it has to be aimed at suppressing a threat, not just punishing a perpetrator.
So if we synthesize all of this for you, the listener, before 9/11, a nation's borders were almost sacrosanct. Now, security can trump sovereignty if that state can't control the threats within its own borders.
That is the absolute core takeaway. Because of the necessity created by ISIS and the global acceptance that followed, any state can now lawfully use force against dangerous non-state actors, terrorists, rebels, drug cartels, you name it, if the host state is demonstrably unable or unwilling to stop them.
So the law has finally caught up to reality. It recognizes that a failed state, a country that can't govern its own territory, is a security threat to everyone else.
Yes. The integrity of that border becomes secondary when it's being used as a safe haven for groups planning murder on a global scale. The war on terror forced international law to overcome these outdated restrictions.
And it provides that solid legal foundation for the very difficult missions still happening today, like the one we're seeing in Palmyra.
Exactly.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the future? We've established the legal mechanism for acting in self-defense, but what about the scale of the potential battlefield?
Well, when you look at the scope of the problem, the implications are massive. The sources point out that the U.S. State Department currently lists 58 designated terrorist organizations.
58.
And they're headquartered in 35 different countries. And that's in addition to the remnants of ISIS we've been talking about.
35 countries that could be harboring the next major threat.
Precisely. So given this newly solidified right to act against a state that is unable or unwilling to control a threat, we have to end with a provocative thought for you to consider.
We now possess the legal right to pursue these threats in any of those 35 countries if their governments can't or won't stop them.
So what does that massive expansion of the legal battlefield mean for global stability? And how many of those nations are now potentially legally permissible targets for immediate and necessary U.S. action? The legal landscape has certainly changed, but the strategic challenges, I think, have only just begun.